The Rhine was running 7 feet above its winter average on the night of March 23, 1945, swollen by a month of hard rain that had turned the mudflats along the western bank into soft ground capable of swallowing a man to the knee in total darkness. At a staging area in the tree line south of Wesel, 24 armored vehicles sat cold and unlit, engines silent, their crews waiting inside or crouched against hull sides in extra cold weather clothing. The artillery preparation had been running for 4 hours on the far bank, and the sky above the eastern horizon pulsed orange and gray from burning positions the guns had found. Most of the vehicles in the staging column were M4 Sherman medium tanks, the standard mount for American armored units in the European theater by the spring of 1945. But at intervals through the column, 12 vehicles sat with a different silhouette. Their hulls were M3 mediums, a design largely replaced in line armored units 2 years earlier. The upper turrets were not gun turrets. Where a standard tank carried a cannon barrel projecting from a rotating mount, these vehicles carried sealed steel housings, approximately the size of a large steamer trunk, with a single horizontal slit running across the forward face behind thick glass that reflected nothing in the dark. No gun barrel. The 12 vehicles were unlike anything else parked in that column, and the 12 crews who had driven them to the Rhine that night were the only people in the staging area who knew what those sealed housings contained, and they were not allowed to say. If this story is pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who's listening. The unit was the 736 Tank Battalion, a specialized armored outfit that had spent the better part of a year training in the Arizona desert at a facility called Camp Bouse, a place that did not appear on standard military installation registers and whose location personnel stationed there were prohibited from identifying an outgoing mail. The vehicles they operated appeared on logistics manifests under the designation T10 Shop Tractor, a label designed to make them look, on any document a German intelligence officer might acquire, like maintenance or engineering support equipment rather than fighting vehicles. The program that had produced the 736th and its sister unit, the 701st Tank Battalion, carried the official name Canal Defence Light, a designation chosen with the same deliberate misdirection, suggesting flood control or engineering work rather than armored warfare. The secrecy surrounding the program was not incidental to its purpose. It was the operational requirement that everything else depended on, because the advantage built into those sealed housings would be neutralized entirely the moment German intelligence learned the housings existed and understood what they were designed to do. What was inside each housing was a carbon arc searchlight. The carbon arc produces light by maintaining an electrical discharge between 2 carbon electrodes, and the technology had been in use since the latter half of the 19th century in theatrical spotlights, lighthouse installations, and military searchlight applications of various kinds. What the CDL installation did with that existing technology was a matter of scale and precision. The system generated approximately 13 million Candlepower at full output. For comparison, a standard military parachute flare produced roughly 30,000 Candlepower at peak illumination. The CDL outperformed a parachute flare by a factor of more than 400. A standard military searchlight of the period, the type used for anti-aircraft work and coastal defense, produced somewhere in the range of 800 million Candlepower over a narrow-focused beam. The CDL was lower in absolute output than a dedicated military searchlight, but was designed for a different application. Directed through the horizontal aperture of the housing, which measured approximately 2 inches in height and 18 inches in width, the beam projected outward as a fan-shaped band rather than a cone, spreading laterally across a target area at the designed engagement range of 600 to 800 yards while maintaining the intensity that made it effective against human vision at that range. The geometry of the aperture was engineered specifically for that purpose. The engineers who designed the CDL had not simply built the most powerful light source they could manage and aimed it at the enemy. Inside the housing, behind the carbon arc assembly, they installed a rotating sector disc driven by a small secondary motor. This disc interrupted the beam at a rate of approximately 13 to 14 cycles per second. The choice of that specific frequency was deliberate, and the mechanism behind the choice was understood by the people who made it. Human vision, when exposed to a flickering light source in the range of 13 to 14 cycles per second, does not perceive the individual flashes as discrete events the way it would at lower frequencies, nor does it smooth them into a continuous light source the way it does above the flicker fusion threshold of roughly 50 cycles per second. At 13 to 14 cycles, the visual system is caught in a zone where the interruptions are perceptible but cannot be tracked, where the eye attempts to accommodate a stimulus that changes too fast to follow but not fast enough to ignore. The result, in most observers after an exposure measured in seconds, is a progressive disruption of depth perception and target acquisition. The ability to judge whether an object in the lighted area is moving toward or away from the observer becomes unreliable. Range estimation collapses. Muzzle flashes from one's own weapon become confused with the ambient glare of the CDL beam, making it difficult to use the flash as a firing reference the way trained soldiers have been doing for years. After sustained exposure measured in minutes rather than seconds, many observers reported disorientation significant enough to interfere with their ability to coordinate movements or operate weapons at all. The crews were not billeted near other armored units where casual conversation might have generated questions. Maintenance on the CDL housings was conducted in enclosed spaces or at night. The precautions were continuous and specific, and they were maintained through months of deployment without the kind of procedural erosion that tends to affect security protocols as the urgency of initial training gives way to the routines of a long campaign. The people responsible for the program understood that the CDL's value rested entirely on arriving at the Rhine, or wherever it was first used, as a complete surprise. If German commanders on the far bank had any knowledge that a disorientation light system was coming, they could have prepared their defenders to look away when it activated, to cover their eyes during the critical crossing window, to rotate forward positions so that blinded defenders were replaced by ones who had not yet been exposed. The secrecy was not a formality. It was the mechanism by which 13 million Candlepower became a decisive military instrument rather than a curiosity. The broader American advantage in night operations that German commanders were documenting throughout the autumn and winter of 1944 did not rest on CDL equipment, which had not yet been committed to combat at that stage. What the Germans were encountering in Belgium and Luxembourg and along the German border was something that had been building for 2 years. The foundation of that advantage was communication. American armored units had been equipped throughout the war with radio sets, primarily the SCR-508 and SCR-528, that allowed a tank commander to maintain simultaneous voice contact with his crew, with adjacent vehicles in his platoon, and with the infantry and artillery elements supporting his unit. The procedures for using those sets had been refined over 2 years of combat in North Africa, in Sicily, and through the long Italian campaign, and by the winter of 1944 the radio net of a standard American armored platoon in contact was a functional instrument for coordinating fire and movement in conditions of limited visibility. This included total darkness, provided the crews had been trained to operate without relying on visual contact with the vehicles around them. German armored doctrine, which had been extraordinarily effective in the fast-moving operations of 1940 and 1941, was built around visual command and control at the small unit level. The German tank commander worked from the open cupola and directed his crew and his subordinate vehicles by what he could observe directly and by what the vehicles around him were doing. German radio equipment was capable throughout the war, but German small unit coordination at the platoon and company level relied more heavily on visual observation and the kind of direct initiative that had made the blitzkrieg concept work so well against opponents who were slower to react. In daylight, on ground that rewarded speed and initiative, visual command and control at the small unit level was often faster than radio coordination, and it had been devastating against opponents who lacked the training or equipment to respond in time. At night, in fog, in falling snow, or in smoke that eliminated visual reference at distances beyond a few yards, visual command and control deteriorated sharply. The advantages it had produced in the open daylight operations of the earlier war disappeared when the conditions for visual observation disappeared. American radio coordination did not deteriorate in the same way under those conditions. A platoon commander directing vehicles onto a target he could not personally see, using bearing and range information relayed from an observation post or from an artillery forward observer, was operating a system that had been designed for exactly the conditions where visual command was unavailable. American night fighting doctrine had been refined specifically through the Italian campaign of 1943 and 1944, where the terrain and the often static nature of the fighting had given company and battalion commanders extended periods in which to test and develop procedures for moving and coordinating armor after dark. The lessons from Italy were specific and practical. They included procedures for marking assembly areas at night so that incoming vehicles could find their positions without headlights. They included communications protocols for maintaining contact between tanks and the infantry they were supporting when neither could see the other. They included protocols for indirect fire coordination at night, using known grid references and pre-surveyed targets rather than observed direct fire, so that armored units could support infantry assaults before dawn on objectives that had been plotted in daylight. They included procedures for halting a column in darkness that prevented vehicles from bunching up or losing spacing in ways that daylight movement made obvious but that darkness concealed until a collision occurred. These were not theoretical improvements to doctrine. They were practices that had been tested under fire and refined by the men who had found out, at cost, what worked and what did not. The men who brought those lessons to the European theater were not writing doctrine. They were telling other soldiers what had kept them alive and what had not. Those lessons arrived in the European theater of operations in the form of updated field manuals, revised training syllabuses, and, more practically, in officers and sergeants who had actually conducted night armored operations under fire and who knew from experience what the standard doctrine left unaddressed. They knew that tank engines produced a distinctive sound at idle audible at distances greater than crews tended to estimate. They knew that sky glow from distant cities or burning towns could silhouette vehicles against ridgelines even on overcast nights. They knew that artillery illuminating rounds fired at too low an altitude created shadow lines that careful defenders could use for concealment, and that the timing of flare support needed to be integrated with movement rather than simply requested and assumed. None of this was theoretical. It had been bought. This was not an incidental side effect of a bright light. It was the design specification, chosen at a specific frequency because the engineers understood what that frequency did to human visual processing. The concept had originated in the early 1930s, credited in most historical accounts to a Hungarian-born inventor named János de Margite, who brought his demonstration to the British War Office and produced results convincing enough that the office committed to formal development. What appealed to the War Office from the beginning was a specific asymmetry the system created. The vehicle operating the CDL could see the terrain in front of it, illuminated by the beam's extreme intensity, because the beam projected outward rather than reflecting back toward the source. The crew inside the housing, shielded behind steel and looking out through armored viewing ports, was not affected by the light they were projecting. The defender facing that beam, in contrast, was looking at 13 million Candlepower strobing at 13 cycles per second, originating from a source at ground level that could not be identified precisely or aimed at with any accuracy. One side could see, the other could not. British development of the CDL proceeded through the late 1930s, survived the chaos of Dunkirk and the organizational rebuilding that followed, and by the time the United States entered the war in December 1941 had produced a working system that the British shared with the Americans under the same classification protocols governing the entire program. The British CDL vehicles were based on the Matilda and Valentine tank hulls. The American version was fitted to the M3 Lee medium tank hull, which had entered American service in 1941, had seen combat in North Africa against German and Italian forces, and was being superseded by the M4 Sherman as the standard American medium tank by 1943. The M3 was available in quantity and its hull structure suited the CDL conversion cleanly, because the upper turret could be removed and replaced with a CDL housing without requiring significant structural reworking of the hull. The lower hull 75mm gun was retained in its sponson mount, giving the vehicle some defensive armament if it was caught in a close engagement. These tanks were not intended for conventional armored combat. Their purpose was illumination of specific objectives under specific conditions, and the 7-5 was insurance rather than primary capability. The training program at Camp Bouse, Arizona ran entirely on night exercises from its beginning. The facility sat in the desert approximately 20 miles east of Parker, on terrain chosen for its geographic isolation. No civilian position within reasonable distance could observe the extreme light output of CDL equipment operating in the desert darkness. Personnel assigned to Camp Bouse were informed of the secrecy requirements in writing upon arrival and again verbally at regular intervals throughout their assignment. The cover story crews were authorized to provide if captured or questioned by an authorized personnel was that the CDL housing was a water purification unit. If a vehicle was in danger of capture, the standing order was to destroy the housing by whatever means available before allowing it to fall into German hands. The priority was explicit: destroy the equipment first, fight if possible, surrender only if fighting was no longer an option. The intelligence value of the CDL was placed above the lives of the crews in that calculus, which gives some measure of how seriously the secrecy was taken at the program level. The training itself was a process of building reliability in darkness. Crews rehearsed movement to battle positions without headlights, learning to maintain column integrity by sound and by the faint outlines of the vehicle ahead at close range. Radio communication procedures were rehearsed until they operated as reliably in complete darkness as they did in daylight. The carbon arc system itself was operated and maintained by crews who had learned to perform every check and adjustment by feel, because any light produced during maintenance work was visible from a distance in the desert darkness and was prohibited. Coordination with infantry and engineer units was practiced through simulated crossing operations on terrain that had been chosen to approximate the conditions crews would face on European river lines. By the time the 736 deployed to the European theater in the summer of 1944, the men who had completed that training were among the most thoroughly prepared night-fighting tank crews in the American Army. What they had been prepared to do was a single specific thing: activate a light on a riverbank, hold it steady while infantry crossed in front of them, and make it impossible for defenders on the far bank to see well enough to shoot. The secrecy that surrounded the 736th and 701st extended to the units they staged alongside in England and in France. Veterans of other armored battalions who trained a bivouac near CDL-equipped vehicles described, in post-war accounts, genuine puzzlement about the sealed housings. The most common assumption, apparently, was that the housings concealed some form of rocket or heavy mortar system still in final development. The water purification cover story, when offered, did not satisfy experienced soldiers who could see the housing was mounted on a tank hull. But the secrecy procedures held. No account of a security breach reached the official record. German intelligence, which had access to significant information about American armored equipment and order of battle in the European theater by the winter of 1944, had no confirmed knowledge of the Canal Defence Light or the two battalions trained to operate it. When the 736 staged in France after the Allied breakout from Normandy, the vehicles were moved at night and covered during daylight halts. Reconnaissance aircraft, German or otherwise, passing over the staging area would have photographed what appeared to be standard M3 hulls, an obsolete design by that point in the war, without any visible sign of the specialized equipment they carried. It was a method that produced some effective fire in conditions where no fire at all would otherwise be possible, and the existence of that method in American crew training created a tactical option that German commanders did not assign to their opponents in their intelligence assessments. The German after-action reports from this period, held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and in the Bundesache Militararchiv in Freiburg, show professionally trained officers working to explain a discrepancy between their expectation of American behavior after dark and the behavior they were actually observing. The reports record, accurately, that American armor was operating at night with a capability they had not anticipated. The explanations offered in those documents vary. Some attribute the American performance to training superior to what German intelligence had been assessing. Some identify equipment advantages that had not yet been identified specifically. Several conclude that German intelligence assessments of American armor capability had been constructed from observation of American forces in the earlier periods of the war, periods that no longer accurately reflected what American units were capable of doing by late 1944. That last assessment was the most accurate, and it appears in the records of more than one divisional staff. The Germans had been studying an army that no longer existed in quite the form they had studied. What German intelligence was not reading, because nothing in the captured or intercepted material gave them any access to it, was the 2-year accumulation of doctrinal refinement that American armored units had been absorbing since North Africa. The German intelligence picture of American night fighting capability was essentially frozen at the state of American capability in late 1942 and early 1943, when American armor had been cautious at night and when the limitations of American coordination in darkness had been observable in the field. Those limitations had been studied, addressed, and substantially corrected in the 2 years since, through a process that German intelligence had not tracked and could not track because the process had happened inside American training cycles and doctrine revisions that were not visible from the outside. By the time the Rhine was in front of them in March of 1945, German divisional commanders were working from an intelligence estimate of American night capability that was 2 years out of date. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's far more in the record still to cover. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. The Rhine crossing at Wesel was set for the night of March 23 into March 24, 1945, as part of Operation Plunder, the British and Commonwealth assault upstream, and Operation Flashpoint, the American Ninth Army crossing under Lieutenant General William H. Simpson. The planning for Operation Flashpoint had taken months, and the intelligence estimate of German defensive capability on the eastern bank was detailed and largely accurate. The Rhine at Wesel in March of that year ran approximately 160 yards wide at the designated crossing points, with a current accelerated by the winter rains and a far bank held by German troops who had been observing the Allied buildup on the western side for several days. The German defenders in the sector included elements of the 84th Infantry Division and a mixture of reserve and Volkssturm units whose quality varied, but whose positions had been prepared and improved along the eastern bank over a period of weeks. They were in place. They were armed. They had clear fields of fire across the river. The German commanders holding that sector had studied the western bank through their optics and through their outpost reports, and they had reason to feel prepared. A defended river line is among the strongest positions in conventional warfare. The attackers must cross open water under fire, in vehicles or boats that cannot maneuver or take cover, against defenders who can see them coming and who have had time to pre-register their weapons on the water. The crossing at Wesel was going to be costly. The German commanders on the eastern bank expected it to be very costly. Several fires were burning on the far bank from the ongoing artillery preparation, and their irregular light fell across the water in a way that partially illuminated the crossing zone and would make assault boats visible to German riflemen and machine gun crews from the moment they put off from the near bank. What the German commanders holding that bank did not know was that their ability to see and aim at the water was about to be taken from them in the first seconds of the crossing. The 736 moved to its riverline positions in the hours after midnight. 12 CDL vehicles positioned along a frontage of approximately 500 yards parallel to the river's edge, spaced roughly 40 yards apart to provide overlapping coverage across the full width of the projected crossing zones. The crews ran through their pre-operation checks in the dark, not by touch alone but by the specific sequence they had rehearsed in the Arizona desert until the procedure was as automatic as breathing. Power connections verified. Arc electrode gap confirmed. Sector disk motor tested at low speed, then shut down to avoid any light leaking through the aperture before the activation signal. The radio net checked and confirmed. The vehicle commanders reported readiness in sequence up the net. The assault infantry staged at the water's edge had not been told what the sealed housings on the vehicles behind them contained. They were told the vehicles were illumination support and that the lights would activate on signal. The assault boats, flat-bottomed wooden and canvas craft capable of carrying an infantry squad across a defended river, had been positioned in concealed slots cut into the bank vegetation by engineer parties working the previous night. The 30th Infantry Division and the 79th Infantry Division were the assault formations in the American sector. Their men were at the water's edge, waiting for the signal that would put them on the river under fire. The infantry did not know what was about to happen on the far bank. The American Army had also developed, through its engineer units, a system for preparing night movement routes in advance that German commanders were not fully accounting for in their assessments of American speed after dark. Routes were marked with small low-profile reflective materials staked along road shoulders and cleared tracks, visible to vehicle drivers moving without headlights but not detectable from the air or from a distance with the unaided eye. The same engineer units that constructed bridges under fire ran night route marking operations that let armored columns maintain road speed without headlights. The marking parties moved quietly and left no trace visible to aerial observation. When they were finished, the routes existed as guides that only the vehicles that knew to look for the markers would be able to use. When a German divisional staff received reports of American armor appearing in an area that their assessment said required 6 hours of daylight movement to reach, the calculation behind that assessment was based on how long the move would take German armored units under German doctrine and in German conditions. The American unit had made the move faster because the route had been prepared, marked, and in some cases rehearsed by the lead elements of the column before darkness fell. What German panzer commanders were encountering in the autumn and winter of 1944, as American armored units drove through Belgium and Luxembourg and into Germany itself, was the accumulated product of those 2 years of development. In after-action reports from elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the 12th SS Panzer Division, and units of the 116th Panzer Division, interrogating officers noted a consistent pattern in German commander accounts. American armor was appearing in positions that German doctrine said armor could not reach at night, and was doing so without the indicators that German crews had been trained to detect. No warning from outpost lines reporting the distinctive sound of slow, tentative movement. No signal flays or traces associated with units that had lost their orientation and were firing to establish contact with adjacent forces. No stalled vehicles blocking the route that German commanders associated with night movement by formations that had not rehearsed it. The American columns were simply arriving. During the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes that December, units of the 2nd Armored Division conducted night movement and attack operations in conditions of snowfall and severely limited visibility that German divisional planners had assessed as effectively restricting significant armored movement. The 2nd Armored Division's actions along the Meuse River on December 24th and 25th, where American armor moved to block the German advance toward the bridges in darkness and in snow, drew specific comment in German after-action reporting. The German commanders who had been tracking American positions noted that armor had appeared on the Meuse line at a time that, by their calculation of movement times under the prevailing weather conditions, should not have been achievable before dawn. Their calculation was not wrong by their own standards. It was wrong because it was calculating against the wrong army. The American units had reached those positions because they had marked and rehearsed the routes, because their radio nets had maintained cohesion through the movement, and because their doctrine for night operations in adverse weather had been developed through 2 years of the kind of testing that German doctrine at that stage of the war was no longer in a condition to replicate. The same pattern appeared in the fighting that stopped the German 2nd Panzer Division at Celles, Belgium, on December 24th and 25th. American armor from the 2nd Armored Division caught elements of the 2nd Panzer at a moment when the German unit had outrun its fuel supply and was static in the snow. The American attack came in darkness. The German unit, which had expected any American armored response to wait for daylight, was attacked before it could organize a defense, and the engagement destroyed the furthest penetration of the German offensive. German divisional records from that action described the American attack as arriving from directions and at a time that their defensive deployment had not anticipated. The German commanders were not wrong in their assessment of what American armor should have been able to do. They were wrong in their assessment of what American armor actually could do by that point in the war. The gap between those two assessments was what American night fighting doctrine had been quietly building toward for 2 years. At the level of individual tank crews, the American night fighting picture also reflected training that had incorporated combat lessons in ways that the deteriorating personnel situation in the German armored forces made increasingly difficult for the Germans to match. American crews by the winter of 1944 had been trained in procedures for engaging targets that could not be directly seen. The technique of using a known compass bearing from a reference point and an estimated range derived from sound, from the muzzle flash of an enemy weapon, or from pre-plotted map positions to lay a gun onto a target without direct optical observation was not a guarantee of accuracy. They knew only that there would be light. The order to activate the CDL vehicles went out over the radio net at the appointed time. The 12 tanks brought their arc lights up in a rolling sequence along the 500-yard front, each vehicle activating within seconds of the one beside it. The transition from darkness to full CDL output took less than 10 seconds from first arc to complete coverage. From the perspective of the German positions on the far bank, the effect arrived without warning and without precedent. 18 million Candlepower of white light, strobing at 18 cycles per second, struck the eastern bank simultaneously across a frontage encompassing the main defensive positions covering the crossing zone. The light was not like a parachute flare, which hangs overhead and produces a moving shadow pattern as it drifts down, and which experienced defenders have learned to use cover from and outlast. It was not like an artillery illuminating round, which burns for a known duration and which trained soldiers had learned, over years of night fighting on multiple fronts, to ignore by looking away until the round expired and darkness returned. The CDL beam originated at ground level, from a fixed horizontal source on the western bank. It covered the full defensive frontage without interruption or shadow. It did not stop. The strobing at 13 cycles per second meant there was no fixed shadow to retreat into, no predictable pause in illumination to use for movement or reassessment, no moment when a defender could raise his head and look toward the river without the full optical effect of the beam arriving with him. The light was continuous in its coverage and unstable in its quality, and those two properties together produced conditions in the German defensive positions that no amount of training for standard combat illumination had prepared those soldiers to endure. The German infantry in the defensive positions covering the Wesel crossing sector responded with small arms fire that was, by the accounts of the assault infantry who crossed and by the after-action reports of the engineer unit supporting them, substantially less accurate than the volume of that fire suggested it should have been. Rounds were entering the water. Rifles and machine guns were firing in the general direction of the crossing. But the rounds were not finding the boats. The assault infantry reached the far bank in the first wave in approximately 8 to 10 minutes from departure, crossing 160 yards of fast river current under fire that should, given the prepared positions and the number of weapons the German defenders had in place, have been far more effective than what the records show it was. The CDL vehicles held their arc output continuously through the first crossing cycle and into the second wave. The crews inside the sealed housings could see the far bank through their armored viewing ports. The German defenders facing them could not see the river well enough to aim. The German after-action reports from the units holding the eastern bank at Wesel are preserved at the Bundesarchiv Militararchiv in Freiburg and in the captured German records collection at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. What those documents contain is professionally written bewilderment. A report from the command post of the German battalion assigned to the immediate crossing sector describes the moment of CDL activation as producing complete disorientation among fighting positions in the forward line, and notes that multiple weapons crews reported being unable to maintain effective aim on the assault craft despite knowing with certainty that the boats were on the water in front of them. A company commander's account, separate from the battalion report and written independently, describes soldiers covering their eyes against the light and states that the time required for those men to resume anything approaching effective defensive fire was measured in several minutes, by which point the first American wave had completed its crossing and established a foothold on the eastern bank. Neither document uses the German military term for searchlight in the standard way that term appeared in tactical reporting. The writers are clearly attempting to describe something they have no existing technical category for. The word used in both accounts, rendered in translation, is closest to blinding or dazzling light source, and both documents note that the light behaved unlike any combat illumination either unit had previously encountered on any front. Neither document proposes a technical explanation for what the light was, where it came from, or how it produced the specific effects it did. The answer was 600 yards away on the western bank, behind sealed steel housings that neither of those officers had ever been told existed. The bridgehead at Wesel was secured with first-wave casualties that were, relative to the strength of the prepared defensive positions and the width of the river, lower than the Allied planning estimates had projected. The crossing in the American sector moved faster than the schedule. The CDL vehicles continued operating along the bank during the consolidation phase that followed, providing illumination for the engineered bridge-laying operations that would make the bridgehead exploitable and making German counterattack movement across open ground near the river hazardous by exposing it to observed fire. A German infantry unit moving toward the river in approximately battalion strength on the night of March 24 attempted a counterattack along a road that fell within the coverage arc of CDL vehicles still operating from their riverbank positions. The unit came under heavy and accurate fire from American infantry and supporting weapons on the near bank that had been observing the German movement clearly in the CDL illumination. The German battalion commander who subsequently filed a report on this engagement noted that American defensive fire had been accurate at ranges that exceeded what he assessed as normal night observation capability for the conditions prevailing. He had no explanation for how the Americans had seen his unit with that clarity at that distance after midnight. The system that had blinded his soldiers at the initial crossing had been showing his counterattack to the American defenders the entire time. The Canal Defence Light was not the only element of American night fighting capability that the Rhine crossing demonstrated, but it was the element that produced the most immediate and measurable effect on the German defense at the decisive moment. The radio coordination that had been moving American armor to unexpected positions throughout the autumn continued to operate during the bridgehead expansion in the following days. Units of the 30th and 79th Divisions moved through the bridgehead with armored support that maintained communication and coordination and darkness at a level German commanders in the sector consistently described in their reports as better than they had anticipated. The pattern that had appeared in the Ardennes after-action reporting reappeared in the Rhine bridgehead documents. American forces were coordinating at night at a level German doctrine had not prepared their defenders to account for. What the German commanders writing those Rhine bridgehead reports could not know, and what the captured document collections show they genuinely did not know, was that the capability they were documenting had been under development for over a decade and had been protected by a secrecy regime of unusual thoroughness. The Canal Defence Light program had maintained classification through the entire Allied campaign in Western Europe without a confirmed intelligence breach. The personnel who knew about the CDL numbered in the hundreds rather than the thousands. The two American battalions, a small number of engineer and infantry units briefed on coordination procedures at the operation level, and a limited number of corps and armor-level planning officers. None of them had talked in a way that reached German intelligence. The German commanders briefed after the Rhine crossing on what their units had encountered, received briefings acknowledging that an unusual American illumination system had been used but containing no technical detail about how the system worked or what the specific flickering frequency had been designed to produce. The technical specifics of the Canal Defence Light remained classified even in internal Allied distribution for months after the crossing. The secrecy that had protected the CDL program through years of development and deployment did not dissolve cleanly when the war ended. Personnel of the 736th and 701st Tank Battalions were formally discharged from service over the course of 1945 and into 1946. Their release from secrecy obligations moved through the Army bureaucracy slowly. Veterans who wanted to discuss their equipment and their operations and unit histories or personal accounts found the classification status of CDL information remained ambiguous for years after the fighting stopped. The official internal history of the Canal Defence Light program, completed within the Army's historical process in the late 1940s, was restricted from public release. The technical manuals for CDL installations remained classified into the early 1950s. When the program was finally declassified and publicly acknowledged, it attracted minimal public attention. The war had been over for nearly a decade. The Rhine crossing was a settled chapter in the public account of the European campaign, and the detail that a classified arc light system had blinded the German defenders at the key moment of the assault crossing did not substantially revise that settled account. The modified M3 hulls that had carried the CDL equipment were processed through the standard post-war disposal cycle. The CDL housings were removed, classified as obsolete equipment, and either destroyed or placed in secure storage that was itself eventually cleared. No CDL-equipped M3 hull survived the post-war years in the configuration in which it had operated on the Rhine bank. The equipment produced in small numbers, maintained under extraordinary secrecy through years of training and deployment, and used for approximately 6 weeks of actual combat operations in the spring of 1945, left no surviving operational example. What remains is the documentary record and a few photographs taken during training that show the modified vehicle from angles that do not reveal the aperture details of the housing. The Army Heritage and Education Center at Carlisle, Pennsylvania holds technical manuals for CDL equipment, portions of the operational records of the 736th and 701st Tank Battalions, and a collection of German after-action reports from units that encountered CDL operations at the Rhine. The American documents and the German documents sit in the same archive, describing the same events from positions that were 600 yards apart on the night of March 24, 1945. The American records describe the activation sequence, the coverage zones, and the effect as observed from the near bank. The German records describe a light arriving without warning, producing disorientation that interfered with defensive fire in ways their writers could not categorize, and leaving the crossing zone in American hands before effective resistance could be organized. Read together, the two sets of documents form a complete account. Each side's records explain the gap in the other side's understanding. The German commanders filed their reports without access to the American technical documents that would have explained what had been done to their soldiers. The American units wrote their operational records without access to the German reports that showed, in detail, how thoroughly the CDL had achieved its designed effect. At the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor at Fort Knox, Kentucky, the Canal Defence Light program appears in the permanent collection in a single display case. Photographs of the modified M3 hull. A technical diagram of the arc housing interior. A notation that CDL equipment was used at the Rhine crossing in March 1945 and that the program remained classified until the 1950s. The display is not large. Most visitors move past it. The visitors who do stop are looking at the physical record of a capability that was built over a decade, maintained in secrecy through an entire campaign, deployed at a decisive moment, and then classified back into institutional silence while the men who operated it went home, and the German commanders who had faced it went home carrying their incomplete accounts of a night that neither side fully understood from the other's position. The display does not mention the specific frequency of the rotating sector disk or the physiological mechanism of the disorientation effect. It does not mention the year of training at Camp Bouse or the specific word count in the German after-action reports describing weapons crews unable to aim at targets they knew were in front of them. Those details are in the technical manuals and the operational records at Carlisle. They are findable if you know where to look. The display case at Fort Knox is the visible edge of a considerably larger story that the archives at Carlisle contain in full, in the handwriting of men on both sides of the Rhine who were each trying, with the information available to them, to describe what had happened on the water that night. German officers who survived the war and were subsequently interviewed by Allied historians and intelligence analysts were asked, in a number of cases, about the Rhine crossing and about the light their units had reported. The responses in interrogation transcripts and oral history collections are consistent. Former officers described the CDL experience as unlike any combat illumination they had previously encountered, as arriving without warning in a form they had no prior knowledge of, and as producing conditions of effective blindness in forward positions that made organized defensive fire impossible during the critical minutes of the first crossing wave. None of the former German officers in the available record correctly identified the Canal Defence Light, or understood the mechanism of the 13-cycle strobing. None had knowledge of Camp Bouse, the 736 Tank Battalion, or the 2-inch horizontal aperture that had projected 13 million Candlepower across their defensive positions. They knew a light had been used. They knew its effects had been severe and outside their experience of combat. Several former officers, in accounts recorded in the years after the CDL program was declassified, stated that they had not learned the true nature of the American illumination system until they read post-war accounts of the Canal Defence Light program many years after the war ended. What had been done to their soldiers at the Rhine crossing was something they had not understood on the night it happened and had not understood for years afterward. The answer had been kept from them, the classification had held, and they crossed back into Germany in custody without understanding the mechanism of their defeat at the water's edge. The German army that faced American armor in the last year of the European War was not the organization it had been in 1940 and 41. By the spring of 1945 it was running short of trained crews, short of aviation fuel for the aircraft that had once shielded its ground operations from observation and attack, short of the production capacity that had allowed it to replace equipment losses faster than it sustained them in the years when sustained offensive operations were still possible. The Tiger II and the Panther outgunned and outranged the Sherman in most standard daylight engagement scenarios. German optical equipment remained superior to American optical equipment through the end of the war. Those advantages had counted for less and less as the conditions in which they were most relevant became rarer and the conditions in which they were irrelevant became more common. The ability to fight at night, to cross defended rivers in darkness, to move armored columns along marked routes without headlights and arrive at the scheduled position without the accidents and disorientation German commanders had learned to expect from American night movement in the earlier years of the war. To illuminate a crossing with a system that blinded the defenders without a single round of ammunition fired. These were capabilities that no comparison of gun calibers or armor plate thickness could measure. The Canal Defence Light was one component in a picture that included radio coordination, engineer route preparation, night movement doctrine, and the accumulated experience of 2 years of combat lessons moving into updated procedure faster than a depleted German training system could track. The CDL was a most visible element because it produced the most immediate and documentable result. Defenders who could not see, could not aim, and could not explain in their after-action reports what had been done to them. The secrecy held through years of preparation and through the operation itself and through the decade that followed. The records confirmed the secrecy and the result both. The river was crossed. The bridgehead held. The 12 sealed housings on the M3 holes in the tree line outside Wesel had done what a year of desert training in Arizona had prepared them to do, and then been classified back into the institutional record while the men who had driven them and the German commanders who had faced them each went home carrying their separate and incomplete accounts of a night when the American army that German intelligence had misjudged fought in the dark with tools German intelligence had never heard of, and crossed the last natural barrier on the road into Germany. The story does not belong to the historians alone. It belongs to the crews who trained in isolation in the Arizona desert for a year, who maintained their secrecy through the entirety of the European campaign, who drove their modified M3 hulls to the Rhine bank after midnight, activated their arc lights on signal, and held them steady while the infantry crossed below them. Those men did their work and went home and said nothing for a decade. The records at Carlisle say it for them now. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.